It's a cycle that never ends. We keep telling ourselves it's over, that treaties and handshakes can erase the past. But deep down, we know better. The Freestar Collective despises us, and if we're being honest, we feel the same about them. We just know how to hide it, behind diplomacy, behind protocol. When the Resurgence was unveiled, the Freestar Collective called it an act of aggression, a provocation, another step towards war. I don't blame them. The Vigilance was already the most powerful ship the settled systems had ever seen. Did we really need the Resurgence? Maybe, maybe not. But the Crimson Fleet continues to grow bolder. Spacer incursions are more frequent, and the United Colonies refuses to be caught unprepared. One thing is certain. This ship is a technological marvel. I've walked her decks. I've seen what she's capable of. And whether or not I agree with her existence, I can't deny her power. The Resurgence-Class capital ship is the new flagship of the United Colonies Navy. 9 decks of sheer naval dominance, built by Lindan Engineering Corporation. She's a Class M battlecruiser. Nothing stands in her way. She's fitted with VX-9 Hellfire batteries, Sentinel strike point defense turrets, and Judication torpedo launchers. The lower decks of the ship feature a fortified hangar bay with full repair capability and reinforced cargo holds. Troop bays ensure soldiers like us are ready for deployment. And the med deck, state of the art. If you're wounded in battle, this ship gives you more than a fighting chance. The 3 middle decks are reserved for crew and officer habitation, while the upper decks are the nerve center of the ship, from battle stations to turret control, comms, and of course the Triton Navigation Core. Everything needed to keep the Resurgence moving. At its peak, Bridge Command, the place where orders are given, where battles are won, and where the fate of the United Colonies is decided. The settled systems are changing. Conflicts may rise again. And when they do, the Resurgence will be ready.
Alright, shipwrights, welcome to another Lindan Engineering build. I've got a special build today. It's a Class M battlecruiser called the Resurgence. While I've attempted Class M builds before, the Resurgence is the first capital ship style build that I've ever done. And she's a huge 232 meter long battlecruiser that represents the new flagship for the United Colonies Navy. She's also the sister ship to the UC-SysDef Vigilance. Now the ship itself is very much inspired by Anarchy Nova's various Class M builds. Anarchy Nova is a friend that I met through the shipbuilding community, and he's one of my personal top 3 shipbuilders in the Starfield ships subreddit. I highly recommend checking out his builds, and I've linked his profiles in the description. If you're a fan of Star Wars, you may know that there's this Battlefront 2 Resurgence that's been going on for the month of June. So I've been playing a ton of Battlefront 2 recently, and the name for this build was taken from this community-led event. Because it's so similar to the Vigilance, for lore purposes, these are sister ships. But back to this build, the Resurgence does have a fully functioning interior with 9 full decks, plus the flight deck, so there's actually 10 usable levels to this ship. The 3 lower decks have the largest footprint, and these are the utility areas of the ship. The main feature is this huge Hopex hangar bay, which comes from the DP Aerospace mod by Dirty Dan 86, and it has a lot of cool functions like this Rev 8 repair workshop. while it's mostly for aesthetics, it feels very immersive when you see all the robotic arms working on the vehicles. There's also custom workbenches, a lift, and multiple door entrances to access the hangar. The utility decks also feature a multi-use cargo hold and brig, a standalone custom medical floor, and a dedicated troop bay deck. The middle levels are all for crew habitation, starting with the mess hall and hydroponics deck, a level for crew and soldiers' quarters that's also custom, as well as a dedicated officer's deck. The upper 3 decks plus flight deck feature this cool command center hab, which is also from DP Aerospace. It's a huge tri-level battle station style hab that has a lot of immersive features to it, like server rooms, tons of consoles, and an awesome navigation hub. DP Aerospace Luxury Habs and Mansion by Dirty Dan 86 is such a cool mod. I haven't checked out all the luxury habs or the mansion yet, but dude, just the hangar bay and the command center alone have so much functionality to them, and it's really cool to see these in the game. So I can only imagine the quality of the other habs and the mansion itself. It gotta be top notch. Now I have a few things that you need to know about this build. First, there is one part that comes from the paid Bad Tech mod, and it's that con tower style docker. If you're over on Nexus or you don't use any paid mods, you'll have to swap this out for an alternative docker to use. Next, this ship is huge, and it will cause issues on normal landing pads because you'll spawn and get stuck underneath the ship when you make it your home ship. In order to actually move around when you load it into the game, at landing pads or ship techs, you'll most likely have to fast travel somewhere. So it's best to use this ship as part of your fleet using the Fleet Commander mod, or when you assemble your fleet with Watchtower. But if you're at a star yard or a star station, then you won't have any issues because you'll be entering and exiting via the docker that's on top. That leads me to the next issue. The sheer size of this build may cause your game to have performance issues or cause your game to crash. So make sure you make a save or quick save immediately after you finish building it. In my last video, I mentioned that this build got delayed due to a crash causing me to lose this ship, so just a heads up there. That being said, this ship is actually surprisingly easy to build. There's really nothing complicated with it, and that's intentional. The less complicated these larger ships are, the better for your game performance. But always remember, if you have any questions or you get stuck anywhere, feel free to reach out to me in the comments. Alright, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I had a lot of fun trying to shape up this battlecruiser, and so I hope you enjoyed the build. But next time I do a capital ship, I'm definitely going to scale it down just to make it a bit more usable and the interior more detailed. I'm thinking about doing a capital ship for each faction in the game, so let me know in the comments if that's something you would like to see. Oh, and remember, make sure to have a backup save and quick save before you make any changes to the exterior or interior of the ship, because building this out, you may run into bugs and performance issues just because the ship is so big. Now the next two build guides are also UC themed ships, and they're both turning out to be a couple of my favorite ships that I've ever done. They're both symmetrical builds, and one of them is a smaller version of one of my most popular uploads, so stay tuned for that. And as always, feel free to reach out to me in the comments if you have any questions or build requests, or if you just want to chat all things Starfield and shipbuilding. This is Lindan, signing off. See you in the Starfield.